Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for God is in the Details, Jewish Law in Search of the Ideal with Rabbi Tsvi Blanchard, Ph.D. I would like to thank our great partners at Congregation Or Zion in Scottsdale for co-sponsoring today's learning event and welcome Andre Ivory to introduce today's guest speaker.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here and to partner with Valley Beit Midrash in this wonderful program today with Rabbi Tsvi Blanchard, Ph.D., who has been renowned for his work in the law faculty of Humboldt University in Berlin and is an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School in New York. He also taught and consulted with Jewish leadership groups across North America for many, many years. Rabbi Blanchard is the co-author of Embracing Life and Facing Death, a Jewish Guide to Palliative Care, as well as academic articles, parables, and stories. And we look forward to our discovery of using Jewish law grounds to discover the ideal. Rabbi Blanchard, it's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. First of all, it's nice that you're all here. It's nice to be back. I once did this in person many years ago in Phoenix. It was very exciting then. It's nice to see how much actually what Rabbi Shmuley Yankelovich has achieved, how much he's really built up. I could say a lot more, but he's on, so it'll embarrass him. But let's just say that he's achieved an incredible amount, starting in those nice days, and it's nice to be here and see part of it. Just so I have some idea of who's in the room, how many of you are lawyers? Put up your hand if you're a lawyer. I got one person. We only have one person besides me admitting to being a lawyer. Okay, that's okay with me. We'll do this. I just want to clarify what we're going to do, what we're going to be trying to do. Can you all hear me? Everybody's able to hear me? No problem? Okay, let's make sure. Are we in good shape? Okay, the topic tonight is about looking at the Jewish legal system in search of the kind of ideals that underlie it. It's not about, and I repeat again, it's not about issues and problems in the Jewish legal system. There are plenty of issues and problems in the Jewish legal system. That's for another time. And Phoenix is welcome to invite me back to talk about how we address those problems and in the system. Tonight, our topic is ideals, things that it's what you're aspiring for, so to speak. We'll come back to that again and again. What kind of ideals are involved in it? What do we find? What kind of ideals do we find within the system, so to speak? It's really actually a huge system. I mean, every religious expression in humanity, in any case, contains a lot more than law. Judaism contains a great deal more than the Jewish legal system or halacha. It contains always sets of beliefs and many stories, interesting stories and practices. So it's huge. We're just, for our purposes, focusing in on that. Also, it has a huge legal system. Covering all legal systems cover these things. We just don't notice it. I mean, Judaism has holiday legislation about what are the holidays. And I always point out to students, yes, and so does the American legal system. There are official legal systems by law in the American legal system too. Okay, almost all legal systems have holidays marked out, some rules for celebrating them, how important or sacred objects are to be treated. This doesn't contain things, doesn't leave out things that most other systems have, even modern Western systems. But it's a system that's extremely old. As far as I know, and I've been doing this long, it is the oldest continuously practiced legal system in the world. The Jewish legal system has been practiced, however you date it, certainly for at least over 3,000, maybe 3,500 years. Down to today, okay, I live in New York, and there are functioning, at least 30 to 40 functioning Jewish courts in New York City that deal with buying and selling, business issues, as well as personal identity issues. My guess would be that somehow or other, some of these same courts exist in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and most towns have some kind of a court in itself or a connection to a court, have a kind of a court. So it's still a functioning legal system. And if you get interested in it, you can sign up to places where they publish their decisions and read those decisions, how they explain to you what they're going to do. A lot of them, unfortunately, are published only in Hebrew, and you've got to be an expert in the system to understand them. But the modern Orthodox world publishes its decisions through the Beit Din of America, publishes in English. So it's a real legal system. We're not focusing on holiday legislation. We're not even going to focus on marriage and law legislation. We're going to look for examples that are found in almost every legal system. What's behind us, pushing us, in the end, is the belief that systems do a lot of things, and one of the things they do is articulate the ideals of the culture of which they're a part, or in this case, in the Jewish legal system, they articulate ideals that the practitioners of the system traditionally believed existed before the practitioners, so to speak. The standard doctrine is that God gives the Torah on Mount Sinai. The legal system is something that the Jewish people get from God. That's not strange, since until the modern era, all legal systems were the gift from the God, or from God or from the gods. Whether you were dealing with Babylonia or you were dealing with the Hittites, everybody had a God who was giving them a legal system, because no society wants to say our system is disconnected from from theology. But a Jewish legal system is no different than that altogether. But it's a huge system, and it covers everything. Okay? And it continues to do that. And we're going to only explore a very small part of it to see what kind of ideals turn up there. If we were exploring other areas of legislation, if, for example, we were looking at Shabbat legislation, what's the institution of the Sabbath like? The Shabbat legislation, how does that work? What does it mean? We would get different kind of considerations, although I am going to suggest that if we did it, we would still turn up the same sort of underlying ideals. And since some of the ideals are going to be very similar to the ones that you find in the Beit Midrash of which you're a part, we come to it independently. That is to say, this is a long-standing system, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to have to look at some kind of texts which help us think about what ideals were behind the legal cases involved. Now, every legal system, as I said, every case has ideals that lie behind it. Anyone who's studied American law, but also German law or French law, any legal situation that happens is really a story in many ways. It's a story, and the story has participants, and they have concerns, and they have problems, and those issues come up before some kind of legal body for adjudication. And of course, those systems have values that help steer them in the directions that they want to go. The American legal system, for example, openly is very concerned with the development of wealth and commerce. Okay, I mean, a classic example of this, there's an early, I think it's 1837, Charles River Bridge case in the American legal system, where they're very straight up. The person had a right to build the bridge over the Charles River. It looked like they had a unique right to do that. And then all of a sudden, somebody built a second right. The corporations were formed to do that. And they said, well, you can't have commerce. If you can only have one bridge, you got problems. So the American legal system is not hiding the fact that the development of wealth is one of its primary and most important ideals. All systems have to be able to support property, or they can't survive. But the Jewish legal system really, throughout most of its history, does not place a lot of emphasis on the development of individual wealth or growth. It's just simply not one of its major ideals. On the other hand, every system has to also have a well-ordered society. I mean, if you can't get along with each other, you're going to collapse. But those issues are functional issues. Issues about how can this system continue to function in the way it does as a system of law that governs how people live together. People want to do business. They want to live side by side. They want to engage in many things together. So in addition to that issue, everybody's concerned about a well-ordered society. Everybody's concerned, every system is concerned with the reduction of violence. But I've labeled them, for our purposes, I've labeled them functional values, meaning the system cannot function without them. If your system cannot reduce violence and control it, if it can't run a well-ordered society, it will collapse. It's not like, well, let's decide, do we really want to have that as part of our legal system or not? If your legal system doesn't help people get along together and settle their differences without killing each other, your legal system doesn't survive. Okay? So those are I'm not saying those are bad things. I think those are good things. and they're functional things, and they're important things. But what we're going to be talking about is an aspect which, I mean, at least two of us, I don't know about the rest of you, at least two of us went to law school and discovered they didn't tell us much about this. Okay. The Jewish legal system has something more than functional virtues that make a successful legal system. They also have something called ideals or aspirations. The system builds in, according to Rav Aaron Lichtenstein of blessed memory, it builds in quite literally a legal requirement to aspire, to try to get past where the system is now and move to something that's considered higher, transcendent, or better. And at that point, when you have to measure what you consider higher or better, is the first time you understand what your real ideals are. Higher or better does not mean where people are richer at the end of the day. Higher or better does not even really necessarily mean where people sleep better at night. We're going to see what it's about and how that operates. To give away the story at the very outset, I'm going to maintain that I'm hardly that person. I shouldn't say this. A whole book has been written about this by the former chief rabbi of South Africa. And anybody, the central living aspiration of the Jewish system is the protection of the weak and vulnerable. The protection of the weak and vulnerable. Okay, that's one of the things which is its values. Okay, other legal systems do have, in the culture of which they're a part, ways in which the weak and vulnerable are protected. In the United States, for example, okay, there are laws passed by Congress which see to it that some people who are weak and vulnerable are supported, but the system itself does not require it. There's nothing in the Constitution which requires us to take care of the poor. On the other hand, the Jewish system is not like that. And that's what we're going to have. We're going to look at some little more complex cases. We're right on the edge. Okay, if you say, well, yeah, there are cases where they talk about it openly. Sure, of course, there are direct legislation in the Jewish system to take care of people who don't have enough to feed themselves. If somebody doesn't have enough money to eat, no place to sleep, no clothes to wear, of course, there are direct legislation within the system itself that says these people are vulnerable, the so-called widows, orphans, converts, people who are vulnerable within the system. There's constant legislation to protect them. That is, we're going to go past it. That's not bad. That's good. Okay, meaning that as part of the black letter law of this system, you may not oppress converts, widows, and orphans. Okay, you're not allowed to oppress any Jew. There's a law prohibiting that, and then there's a law that prohibits you in addition. And that's the very serious thing in the system. How many different times you're told not to do something? It's a little complex that way because it's biblically. You have to read the Bible. You'll see that they repeat themselves in lots of different ways. So these people are singled out at the beginning. It's no genius to say that the legal system takes account of people who are vulnerable. It certainly does. It tells you, you see that person over there? That person is a convert. That person doesn't have a family or friends that they came in with to protect them necessarily. Be careful how you talk to them. You hurt their feelings. Don't remind them that they're converts. Make sure that they're okay and taken care of. Or somebody who's a widow and an orphan. Of course, in a patriarchal society, which, by the way, is almost every society down to the present age and maybe even in the present age. Okay, widows and orphans are very vulnerable. Yeah, and there's legislation that directly, whatever your theory of where it came from, the Bible itself legislates. Biblical legislation requires you to take care of them. So in that sense, there is an interest in making sure that people within society who are vulnerable have their problems addressed. But I want to go farther than that in order to think about the question. Okay, because it's not a lot of aspiration in that part of the game. Okay, that's straight up. If you don't do that, you're not failing to aspire. You're failing to live up to a duty imposed by the system on you. It's not just an ideal of the system. A lot of ideals of the system. Okay. This is what the system. It's black letter law in the system. It's black letter law in the system. So we're going to look at some kind of examples. Okay, and as I said, remember this system. It's still practiced. It's adaptive and it's functional, of course. I mean, it's been around for 3,500 years, so of course it's adaptive and functional. If it weren't adaptive, it'd be long gone. If it weren't functional, it'd be long gone. course, it's still here. Okay, but we're going to look at these other kinds of cases. I'm trying to keep repeating myself, but think about what I'm saying. The usual, of course, one of the things we're going to return to would be something called lifnim mishurat hadin. The phrase shurat hadin is stands for what in English we would call black letter law. Means that there's certain kinds of situations in which you say, you ask me what the law is, I know exactly what the law is. I know exactly what the law is. Okay. And somebody says, yeah, but I want you to do more than that. And they say, yeah, am I required to do more than that? The very first case I ever thought about, I think the Jewish law, never connected this to Jewish law at all. I took a philosophy of law course as an undergraduate in college, and the professor started out by saying, X rents an apartment from Y, promises to pay a certain amount of money every month. The law says that if X does not pay that amount of money for 3 months running, Y can force them to leave the apartment. He said, X has not paid now for the third month, and Y has come to us to force X out of the apartment. So what is the law? So he said, what do you mean, what is the law? X has to leave. You didn't pay your rent for 3 months, you're evicted. Goodbye. He says, now I want to change the case description. X is a 96-year-old widow, lady, sick. Y is a major corporation. And it's January. How do you feel now? Just going to send the sheriff over to pull her out of her apartment? How do you feel about that? He said, we're going to talk about that. How does that happen? What are you going to do now in a circumstance like that? And for the first time, I realized it's a little more, all of these issues, just a little more complex than I ever thought. But there is this notion of lifnim mishurdin. The law would say one thing, but you've got to go beyond the law. Because the system wants something better than just keeping the minimal rules. You got to go beyond that law because the system wants something better than that. Okay, let's have a look at some of those examples, which is what I'm going to read them out to you in just a minute. This is one of my favorite cases. Got it written down here. This is one that's found in a place called Baba Metzia, part of the Talmud. Okay, the Gemara tells us, let's start with it this way. The Bible begins the system, then there's a long pause about which we don't know a lot, and then there's an explosion in the second century, first and second century, an explosion of rabbinic material. Clearly, it's older than the rabbis discussing it, so it must have been around for hundreds of years before they began to talk about it and write it down. We don't know how far, so technically speaking, what you can say is the system was practiced when it looked like, but the explosion of materials takes place in rabbinic Judaism, which is what most of us are. We're not Karaites, we're rabbinic Jews, which means people for whom the rabbis are a major feature. Okay, so a lot of stories in the Talmud and in the Mishnah have to do with what the rabbis thought. But the rabbis don't think they're making this up. I mean, not all of it. They think they're making some of it up, and sometimes they say, we made this up. Okay. They think a lot of it is been transmitted, or a lot of it's the application of values that have been transmitted. But in this story, and it's a Talmudic story. Remember, the Talmud is composed of something called the Mishnah, which is written down in the year 200, and the Gemara, which is usually said to be written down around the year 500. The Gemara is material that happened between 200 and 500. Okay, and then there's a story in there. There were some porters, and they were working for a very important man named Rabba, the son of Rav Huna. Rabba was an important rabbinical figure, and he's the son of an even more important rabbinical figure, Rav Huna. Okay, and he had some people working for him, and they broke a barrel of wine while they were handling it. They were moving a barrel of wine, and they broke it. Okay. Now, he said, inasmuch as they were obviously clearly somewhat negligent in this case, the strict letter of the law would have held that they're liable for the damage. And since they have been, as the text says, remiss in performing their assigned task, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You were negligent in moving the barrels. Okay, they broke and there was damage, and you did that. And when I come to court, what I would like to say is, I'm not going to pay you. I know I hired you to move them, but you broke them and spilled them. So I'm not going to pay you. And of course, how do I know that you are going to see to it that you pay me back for the damage you did to me? in these, I paid a lot of money for this wine. These barrels cost me something. Not only do I not owe you money, you owe me money. After all, you broke my wine barrels. So he said, you know what? I have a way of making sure you pay me back. I'll hold your clothes. I'll hold your clothes. Okay. And somehow or other, their work clothes that ended up in his possession. They had something to wear. You don't have to walk around naked. But I have possession of your clothes. I'm not going to give them back to you. I'm not going to give them back to you. So they come to court. The workers come to court. They come and they tell Rav, okay, and Rav says, we're talking about, Rav is talking to them, and he says to Rav Huna, let's see, listen to the case, and return their clothes to them. Huh? Return their clothes to them? Is this the din? Is this the actual law that I am required to return one piece of security that guarantees that they for sure will, in fact, pay me what they should pay me? You want me to give this back to them? This does not make sense to me. Isn't the din? Isn't if the black letter law would allow me to seize these things to guarantee appropriate payment? Is this the law? Yes, he said. Yes, it is the law. What's the quote that proves it? He says, what's the source of this law? We have other sources that say that I am allowed to say. He said, the source of this law is, quote, that you may walk in the ways of good men. That you may walk in the ways of good men. That's why you have to give them their clothes back. And walking in the ways of good men trumps the black letter law of the economically being able to what? To take surety. All right, so he did what he was told. He returned their clothes. Whereupon they said to him, we're poor. We've labored all day long, and now we're very hungry. We don't have anything. You didn't pay us anything. We've worked all day. We have nothing left. The judge, Rav says to Rav Huna, go and pay them their wages. Huh? Pay them their wages? They broke my barrels. Is this the din? Is that what the law really requires? Is that the technical law? If I went and looked this up, okay, in a book of laws about employer-employee, is this the law that I had in addition to them? They broke the barrels and I now have to, in addition, I have to actually pay their wages? Yes, he said. Well, what's your source? The answer is keep the path of the righteous. The first legislation that says that you can't take their clothes is that you may walk in the ways of good men. What requires you to what? To pay them is keep the path of the righteous. All of a sudden, there's a similar rule in the Palestinian Talmud. All of a sudden, these two things are equal. They are equal. They're not just ethical beliefs. Good people, a good person would do this. That's what you should do. He says, is this the law? He says, yes, it is the law. The law incorporates your requirement to do this, to walk in the ways of good men. The law incorporates this. It is not a good thing to do because you're a good person, because you're an aspiring rabbi, because you want to get into the world to come. None of that is why I'm asking you to do this. I'm telling you as a judge in a law court, you've got to give them back their clothes and pay them their wages, because there are two other laws, which in this case take precedence over your right to collect. Now you think to yourself, that's really sort of nice, actually. The Kippur is when I first read it. That clearly demonstrates that there is some kind of underlying ethical ideal at work in the system itself. Because he's not citing this as a good thing to do, what a nice person would do. He's not trying to talk him into being one of the good guys. It's not a matter of working out a pshura, kind of mutual agreement between you. He's saying, no, you ask me for a legal decision. I'm giving you a legal decision. You got to return their clothes and you've got to pay them their wages. And when I'm asked to cite a source for this, I don't cite some code in some other place. I cite a biblical code. The code tells me that I have to do certain things. It tells me in a very general way, walk in the path of the righteous. But it means quite seriously, walk in the path of the righteous. It means that seriously, which means that we have to continually go back over the implications and meaning of the phrase, what is it here and now to walk in the path of the righteous? Now, of course, maybe 1,000 years earlier, you would have gotten a different decision. And maybe 1,000 years later, you'd have gotten a more expansive decision. What's striking about the scene is that it says these guys are vulnerable. You see that they're vulnerable. Righteous people do not take advantage of the vulnerabilities of poor people. They don't do that. They don't do that. So you can't do that. You can't do that. Not just it's not nice to do that, not just it's unethical to do that, it is a violation of biblical legislation to do so. How come it's not specified specifically in the Bible? Because the Bible has to speak about general classes of things. The Bible cannot tell you what in each and every generation a righteous person will do. The Bible would be 95 volumes long, we wouldn't even understand it. The best I can do is I have a general two verses, with 2 bits of legislation, 2 bits of God says do this and do that. And your job is to figure out what it means because that's what he asked you to do. What did he ask you to do? No different than the Constitution provides for a right of privacy. Well, what is privacy? Well, we have to figure that out. What is privacy? It doesn't tell you what privacy is. It doesn't define what privacy is. That's what you do. But once you figured it out, that's what the law requires. You can't say, well, you added it. Wouldn't it be a nice thing to give this person their privacy? No, it's not a nice thing to give the person their privacy. You're required to do it. Same thing here. Okay. There are certain, and this, you see, that's good. Now you think to, whoa, wait a second now. All of a sudden you're identifying for a brief moment with the guy who owns the wine. Hold it. I have these barrels of wine. You're moving them from one place to another. You broke the barrels. I lost the wine. Don't you owe me money for the wine? The decision doesn't deny that he owes him money. They do owe money. They are responsible for paying him back. And they will go on being responsible for paying back. What he can't do is to take their clothes and withhold their wages to ensure that he gets compensation. There's a different way to handle the question of what to do about the fact that we broke. Yes, of course they owe him the money for damaging his goods. This is not a question of, hey, look, the law wants you to be such a nice guy that if somebody breaks your property, you're supposed to say, that's okay with me, I forgive you. No, you're entitled to say you're going to get repaid. And the court will try to work out ways that happens. The same way if you borrow money in biblical law, you borrow money, but you don't have any visible assets. If the court thinks you have visible assets, it will go in and look to see if you have assets. Of course, it's going to look to see if you have assets. But supposing it looks and you're broke, you're just dead broke. I can't go as your creditor. I just can't go into your house and turn up everything to see whether or not you have assets. The court will check whether you have assets. If you do, it will require them to be paid to this person according to a certain way. And if you don't, some other solution will be found. But the creditor can't actually walk into the debtor's house and to look for it, because that's embarrassing and invasive. That's embarrassing and invasive. So he doesn't get to do that. But of course, you still owe him the money. There's actually no bankruptcy law in Judaism. If you borrow money from somebody, you owe them the money forever. The only exception is if you borrow according to the American legal system, which has a bankruptcy provision, and then you default, you can take advantage of that because the understanding was from the beginning that you were using the American system, which has a bankruptcy provision. So that's our first example, the porters and the bottle of wine. And all of a sudden, there are 2 examples of the law saying inside the law itself, there's a concern for people that are vulnerable. These guys are vulnerable. The next one is Bava Metzia 783a. I'm going to get to there. Hold it. I can do that. There it is. It's a Talmudic passage. It begins with a Mishnah, and it talks again in people with different clear economic statuses. It's about an agricultural society in which people have fields. People live in towns. They get hired. They get up in the morning. They come out to the field to work on it. It's usually day laborers. Okay. And then they work for the day and then they go home. And in the beginning, there's a kind of contract usually a verbal contract between the guy who owns the field and the person who's going to come out and work it. And they agree on most things. Now, there's a complex situation that develops. Okay. When Asocher Tapolim, somebody hires laborers, and he says to them, "Lashkim lariv." He tells them, "I want you to get up early, and I want you to continue working until you come in late." Makom shenago shelo lashkim shelo lariv, in a place where the general custom is that workers do not have to get up before dawn and walk out to the field, and don't have to stay in the field even until it's dark. Eino rashayik lekofan. He can't force them. He can't force them. Makom lazun. If there was a custom to feed them, he has to feed them. Akol kamin agamadina. Everything has to follow the local custom. Now, what's interesting here, of course, is it's not clear what this we're actually looking at. We could be looking at a piece of labor legislation which says custom should be the rule in agricultural legislation at this time, during this time and place. Minhag, custom should be the one thing to do it. There's no question about that. Okay, and maybe it's just telling owners, by the way, this is a code, and the code is you're not permitted to force people to come earlier and get up earlier to stay late. Excuse me. That's possible. The Talmud will not treat it that way. I think probably it might have been at one time a piece of straightforward protective legislation based on minhag. But when you get to the Talmud, they're saying that's not what actually happened. The case they're dealing with is Ma'aseh Rabbi Yochanan. He said, well, let's skip that. We haven't got time for that. Let's just get to where the Gemara's discussion itself. But this is obvious, says the Gemara. Pshita, this is obvious, says the Gemara. What do you mean, the statement says that an employer can't force his laborers to get up early and keep working until very late. Of course, it's obvious that he can't do that. If the custom is not to get up early, and if the custom is not to stay late, he can't do this. It's just obvious. So on what right did the employer even think he could do so? How is he coming in front of the court and saying, you know what? I want you to make them stay later. I want you to make them come earlier. The custom is not to do that. On what basis would he even think that? So the Gemara says, wait a second. It's turned what might have been originally a piece of protective legislation into a direct case. No, it says this kind of case has to be a ruling when in a specific kind of circumstance in which the employer increased their wages beyond what was usual. You have an implicit contract here. Nobody said anything about anything. So we don't really know what people had in mind. Okay? The employer offered them more money than people are usually paid for doing what they did. So the employee says the employer could say to the laborers, I imagine that as the employer claiming in court, I increased your wages. The understanding was that you get up early and continue working late for me. That's what I thought. Here we're standing in court, and I gave you more money. Everybody's paid 10, and I'm paying you 12. And I did that because, obviously, I wanted you to come early and stay late. You're cleaning my house. You usually do it for 8 hours. Then I give you $20 more a day. I would expect you're going to come a little early and stay a little late. What did you think? That you can imagine the employer saying. So the workers, of course, can say back, we thought that the fact that you increased our wages was you wanted us to perform a much higher quality of work for you. We didn't think you wanted us to work longer hours. We thought you wanted us to work more deeper and harder at that. You hired us to say unload trucks for a particular while. You wanted us to really move those things off the platform into the truck, the trucks into the platform. In this case, you wanted us to get there and really work hard on that. Now, the truth of the matter is, both of them, I translate this into a law case. In front of you are two people. The employer is saying, I want, I really think they have to do this because after all, I pay them more. What are you talking? It's a contract that everybody knows what the contract means. I said that they should getting paid more money. They should have been smart enough to figure out I want them to work longer. And they're saying back, well, no, that's not the case. No, that's not what happens. They're saying, that's not really the case. We thought you were working to perform quality work. So I do my due diligence as a judge. Remember, the Jewish law is a law-based system. Jewish law is a law-based system. So as a judge, I go and investigate. Yes, I see that in fact that things are as they've been described. And I got a problem. Both sides have got a pretty good argument. It's not a crazy idea that when the guy offered him more money than usual, he expected longer hours. But it's equally not a crazy idea that he expected harder work. And I can't find any evidence to tell me which. I just can't. I can see that there is such a thing as harder work, and I can see that there is such a thing as hours. And for a moment, I turn to my Mishnah, but it doesn't help me because the Mishnah is whatever the custom is. But the custom won't work in my case because he gave more money than is customary. He paid them more money. So don't tell me the custom is we don't stay late. The custom is you don't get 12, you get 10 is the custom. What am I going to tell? How am I going to decide a case like this? Now, the Gemara does understand, and later on in Jewish law, it rules in favor of the employees. It rules that he can't force them to come early and to stay late. They have no better proof than he has. They don't have any better proof that that's what he had in mind. They pocket the 12 dinarim, even though they didn't come early and they didn't stay late, because they have a good enough explanation that they gave him harder work during that day, which justifies the higher amount of money. This would be not a problem. One of the reasons most systems push for good contracts is it would be solved a lot better if we just talked about this in advance through contracts. But that's not the way life is lived in small agricultural communities in the second, third, and fourth centuries. Life doesn't work like that. So it's an implicit contract. I'm not quite sure what to do. And he says, if you're not quite what you should do, you err on the side of the vulnerable person, which are the workers, not the employer. He owns the fields. It's true. He's unhappy that he paid more money and got something he didn't really want. He didn't really want them to work harder. He really wanted them to come early and stay late. But he didn't say anything about it, and the workers didn't say anything about it. But for a moment, therefore, you see, if it comes down to they're on equal footing, you rule in favor of the vulnerable party again. You rule in favor of and that's black. Is that black letter law? Sure it is. Sure it is. Someone says, is this system, God as an ideal, protecting the vulnerable? You say yes. Because all things being equal, the vulnerable are protected by the decision, not just by a ruling, which I'm not running down, that says take care of widows and orphans and be good and kind to converts. But a thing which says, if the law case comes before you and there is a vulnerable party, you are supposed to work out as much as possible, not a way to free them first from their obligations. Of course, the workers eventually will have to pay. Of course, you're going to work it out, but not in a way that makes it impossible for them to go on. Secondly, even in cases where the guy already has paid them, he can't get his money back. Why? Because he can't establish that there was no other way to interpret the contract but that the way that the workers did. That's why we have lawyers. So we don't want to be in that kind of circle. But why do we care? Why don't we turn it around and make it the other way? By the way, there's no question that the Hittite system would have favored the employer. Other systems would have favored the employer. I have a friend who does Roman law. I don't know if he's correct or wrong. He says that system would have said the law favors the employer. The Jewish system doesn't favor the employer, which tells you something very important about what it is. They're a vulnerable group of people, protected only by custom or by a court that's willing to construe things in their favor, as long as it doesn't deprive somebody else of what they're entitled to. In both these cases, it's an underlying ideal, not just that it's a nice thing to do, which is not bad. Not just that you have to do this because you do the right and the good. Doing the right and the good is in and of itself part of the system. It's like my example was the right of privacy in the Constitution. It's a right they have inside your system. The way they have a right in the biblical system to harvest the end of the fields. They have a right 1,000 years later in a commercial society or a high-level agricultural society to be protected in their favor, both their dignity and their financial circumstance. Again, nobody's going to try to rob the rich to pay the poor. This is not a Robin Hood system. But it is a system which says, pay careful attention to what the right way to be is. What is it to be a person who walks in the way of the righteous? I'm just using that as short form for all those two verses that I quoted you. What is it to do that? And it's built into the system itself. I'd like to pause now just to make sure. I don't want to move on to another big topic if you have a lot of questions yourselves. So let's say for a moment, the floor is open if you have any questions with what we've done so far.
Yeah, I see Randy has a question. Please go ahead.
Okay.
I have like one quick comment and two little questions.
Okay.
One, the right to privacy in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Up for grabs now.
I got it. Believe
Okay.
me, no. I teach it for them. Yes, I know.
Okay. And then one thing, the Jewish system of what you've described, was it developed to include non-Jews at any point, or just your neighbors, the Jews?
No, it depends which area of the system you're dealing with. In the Bible, parts of it include non-Jews, parts of it don't. By the time you get to the 1st century, most of it includes non-Jews as well as Jews. For practical reasons, it's not clear what they really think. They know that they cannot get along with these people if they don't treat them equally. So they apply the same kinds of basic rulings to them that they would apply to a Jew. Okay, because otherwise we can't live together. In the Bible, some things, okay, a person who isn't Jewish, who lives in the Jewish society in the Bible, has a lot of protections that are accorded to them. And it turns out that, of course, if they fall in hard times, you're required to support them the way you would support a Jew. Okay, and that's a law. You don't get to say, I don't feel like it. After all, they're not really Israelites. You got to support them. Okay, but I would say it'd be a little misleading to suggest that they had anything like the kind of full protective system that the Jews had. They're a vulnerable group, so they have certain specified protections that are accorded them. By and large, they're living by themselves according to their own rules, etc. But when you interact, unless they're clearly vulnerable, like they're poor, if they're really poor, you have to feed them. Okay, but other than that, you have to be fair-minded and fair when dealing with them, etc. But you don't have the same kind of responsibilities to them that you would have to another Israelite. By the time you get to the time of the Talmud and the Mishnah, okay, of course, you have connections within the Jewish community to other Jews that are more profound, at least for lack of a better term, demanding, and they spread out. Some of them spread out because anybody in the image of God has to be treated this way, which means therefore that non-Jews have to be treated this way. Sometimes they spread out because we got to get along, and there you see both reasons offered. Sometimes you do this because a person cannot be treated in such a way, and sometimes you do this because we can't get along with them if you don't do this. They're going to hate us. So that sort of half answers your question.
And I just wanted to ask one more thing. Is there something in the Bible that says don't rule on behalf of a poor person just because they're poor, and don't rule on behalf of a rich person just because they're rich?
Yes, indeed. I built in a protection against that question and you're smart enough to have turned it up. Okay. The Porter's, first thing I asked about the Porter's case. What are you talking about? You're not allowed to favor the poor person. And I said, that's correct. He doesn't favor the poor person. You still owe him the money. The guys who broke the barrel still owe him the money for the barrel. Their rights, they are not, he doesn't say, let it go. He can if he wants, but legally speaking, you can't say the law says that you can't collect. Yes, he can collect, but not in this way. Not in this way. That's why the ways of the righteous do not mean that you get to walk all over somebody because they have to have money. They are entitled to the same justice you are. But justice does not mean that you can hold on to their clothes. Justice does not mean that you don't pay them. What justice means is that they have a right to recover. They have a remedy at law. They have a right to recover. And it never stops. Now, of course, it's a little more complex than I just said, and that itself would be an hour-and-a-half lecture as to how over the course of time they tried to work out what I think is your excellent question about isn't there some rule about not favoring the, justice doesn't allow you to favor? Yeah, it is. I'm giving you the best and most straightforward answer to the question. Okay, but there are, if you wanted, somebody could write a short article and back and forth on it. But this pretty much, by and large, the accepted view is you don't lose your rights because you're rich. You're entitled to justice, but it doesn't mean you're entitled to take the guy's clothes. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, there are a couple in the chat that I can read out.
Would you please?
Yeah, the first is from Jacob. He says, you mentioned near the beginning that these laws also have applications to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you please expand on that?
I'm sorry, I did not. If I mentioned that, I didn't mean to. None of this conversation has been meant to apply to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If I sounded like I was doing that, I take it back. I didn't say anything of the sort.
No problem. Could maybe a mishearing, misunderstanding.
Okay.
The next question was, do non-Jews bring cases to Jewish courts?
In today, I mean, in American existing courts? Is that what the question is? Are there non-Jews who come to Jewish courts seeking redress? The answer to that question is yes. Yes, they do. In the diamond industry, for example, the diamond industry is dominated primarily by Hasidic Jews, and if not Hasidic Jews, then very religious Jews. Okay, but it's also got lots of people that aren't Jewish at all who trade in diamonds. At the Diamond Exchange in New York City, at 57th Street, there is a full-time Jewish judge standing by to adjudicate cases, and 9 Jews bring him cases all the time. So in the present situation, yes, non-Jews bring them to him. In the 11th century, Rashi, the great Jewish scholar, was so considered such a fair judge that many non-Jews brought cases to his court between themselves, not just with a Jew, but between themselves, because they thought he had a good sense of justice and what it went. But even down to today, okay, it's not typical. Typically, if you live in the United States, you don't adjudicate things in your Jewish court. But in the exception are cases where, like the diamond business, where in fact it does affect it. And there are non-Jews who bring cases in, rent cases sometimes. A non-Jewish landlord or a non-Jewish renter from a Jewish landlord may have a difference of opinion, and they may go to a Jewish court to resolve it. And that's you can't go to the Jew cannot take advantage of the non-Jew. He has to get permission from a Jewish court to in any case to if he goes to an American court. But yes, non-Jews sometimes bring cases. It's not typical. But it happens. The cases published by the Beit Din of America, none of them are cases in which non-Jews brought law. But I happen to know those cases. I happen to know cases where they did. So I'm answering yes. In fact, this happens. And said in the Diamond District, it happens all the time. Okay. Also, first, I want to say I see a number of names here of people who don't live in Phoenix. So thank you so much for taking the time to join in on the Valley Beit Midrash. It's a pleasure to see your names. Nice to see a lot of them anyway. Okay. What we've been doing today is talking about what kind of ideals. Again, there are other ideals, but the search for ideals in the Jewish legal system. And the way you do that is 2 ways. Number 1 is sometimes it articulates its own ideals. A system articulates its own ideals. But then it's the job of it's a judge-based system, remember. There's no legislature until the rabbis begin to legislate. In any case, all cases are heard by judges. There are no juries. But there are the rabbis themselves are legislators as well as scholars, and you struggle to articulate what those ideals are. They're quite aware that there are functional ideals of the system. They know that certain things have to happen in order for the system to survive and continue, either because they live with non-Jews or because if the courts don't have believability and allegiance within the Jewish community, people will go outside them to get cases resolved. Okay. But in addition to what I would call practical and clearly beneficial pragmatic concerns that all legal systems have to come to terms with, I shouldn't say all. It's very clear that the Soviet legal system for a very long time had no need whatsoever to come to terms with those things. The Chinese system still doesn't have a need to come to terms with those things. But most of the Western systems, or even most most systems in various parts of the law, whether you're starting with tribal systems or whether you're starting with more advanced, complicated societies, the bottom line is most of them bury their ideals, but they're there. That's why I gave the American example. Some cases can't be decided unless you know what the ideals of the system are. And sometimes it's disputed. I said, if you study the history of it, you can see the ideal at work. The United States was expanding. It wanted to expand. It wanted to expand economically. So you look at a number of cases and you realize that those ideals are pushing it. Of course, the downside of that is that it can also get the wrong things that aren't ideals. And it has to work itself out over time. Nothing's perfect. Okay? But as a general rule, systems are driven in one way. And then I said, let's turn to the Jewish legal system. Are there any texts that suggest to us that there are internal to the system itself a kind of generalized legislation which requires careful attention to what the implications of the ideal of that system is? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, there are. And I gave you a couple of examples. If we'd had lots more time, I had a whole long list of 4 or 5 others, okay, that are really there. Okay. Vulnerable people are to be protected. Okay, and that's no question about that. Okay, there's no question about that. The system. And what the chief rabbi of South Africa said was, if you look at the system, you will see that it's designed in all different areas. And if we weren't, I kept it down to business law, the law having to do with businesses, because people always forget that. Oh, he's going to talk about Shabbos. I'm happy to talk with you about anytime you like Shabbat legislation. Okay, but that's not the same thing as saying, guess what? In the nitty-gritty of economic dealings, in contracts about people who are doing jobs in agricultural circumstances, workers who are moving barrels from one place to another, in the nitty-gritty of business world, people are still concerned. The same way there's a general rule that says one person can't, if you're in business, somebody can't just go set up next to you and be in the same business. Okay, so the system clearly wants to protect, you're having a successful, but unless they can demonstrate that they're going to sell a product much cheaper to the benefit of these individuals. Does it ever get raised? Sure. The Beit Din of America had a case in which a guy had a chocolate, sold chocolates. And then somebody opened a shop next to him, very close to him, part of which had chocolates. And they brought it into the court, looking at it under what conditions yes, under what conditions no. So, of course, built in is the need for people to survive and a concern for those who are trying to make it. This is past that. This is people who, technically speaking, you were moving his wine. You were careless and you broke his wine. Which is, said to Randy, yeah, of course you still owe him money. You don't get out of owing him the money. You can't say justice doesn't. Justice requires that you pay him. The question is, how are we going to pay it out? The same way I'll finish with this. That takes me back to our original case. It's January, and the person renting the apartment is a widow, an old lady with no money. And in a Jewish court, it says, you don't just kick her out of her apartment. You somehow or other find a solution. You don't say, okay, you can kick her out. You can't kick her out. The solution isn't that you're not going to be paid. You will have to get paid. You're not going to say you have to let her live there for free. But there must be an alternative solution to just sending the sheriff to put her out on the street in the middle of winter. That wasn't always the case in human life in other systems, but it was always the case in the Jewish system. You're going to have to let her stay there until we're going to work something out. But I'm not saying she doesn't have to pay you because she's poor. She does have to pay you. Or somebody has to pay you. She can't live there if she doesn't pay. But the solution is not put her out into the cold in the middle of January. And a lot of life is like that. The search for what are the right ways to do things. The paths of the righteous. The attempt to create a society that's a righteous society. That's a deeply Jewish endeavor. Attempting to create a world in which, do we get it right now? We get it wrong a lot of the time, like everybody else. And that's for a different talk about what needs to be fixed in our system. But nonetheless, I hope you gave me enough examples to at least get you think, He can't be totally crazy. He's got an idea. Maybe he would keep up many more examples. If you gave him a lot of time, he'd give you more and more examples. You only gave him 40, 45 minutes. He can give you 2 examples to sort of tell you what he's talking about. That's up to you. Go, what I would say is go look yourselves. Look it up, see what you can find yourselves. None of this is closed to you. All these texts have been translated and they're online at the Safari Library, translated into English. If you can use Google, even if you can't read Hebrew, you can find out an enormous amount about this even without it. And if you're having trouble, send me an email and I'll tell you what to Google. But thank you very much again. I'm glad to have been back. I'm glad to see how much has been achieved since the early days. Okay, it's really terrific that Shmuel pulled all this up, and thank you. Thank you, Alex, for all your help in setting it up. Thank you, Andre, for facilitating my way in, and thank you, Fallaway, for being here. And I hope I get a chance to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to learn with you again. Just quickly want to let everyone know about some of our programs coming up next week. We've got a lot going on for Purim. On the 12th, we will be hosting Rabbanit Shalhevet Kahana for her talk, Behind the Veil, Esther's Subtle Genius in the Purim Story. And then on Thursday, Rabbi David Jaffe for his talk, Breaking Out of Personal and Family Patterns of Behavior, Esther as a Model of Growth and Courage. If you're in the Phoenix area, please join us at our office on Thursday night. We'll have a Megillah reading and dinner, so please check out our website to get all the details on that as well. And thank you all for learning with us today.